everyone, and welcome to the 29th episode of The Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Anju Grossman, or as friends of the Atlas Society know me, JAG. I am CEO of the Atlas Society, which is the leading nonprofit introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in creative and cost-effective ways, such as setting up this mobile studio with an ironing board and a very sophisticated makeup mirror light system. Today, we are joined by Johan Norberg, man who needs very little introduction. But before I even get into his introduction, I want to remind all of you who are joining us. If you're joining us by Zoom, please make sure to ask your questions by typing them into the Zoom chat, or if you're joining us on YouTube, just type your questions into the comment section. We will get to as many of them as possible. Johan Norberg is joining us from Sweden, where it is 10 p.m. So we're very grateful for him to stay up to join us today or tonight. He is the best-selling author of many books, including Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future, and In Defense of Global Capitalism, in which he, and also, of course, his most recent book, Open, the Story of Human Progress, which argues that the key to human success is openness. The freedom to explore and exchange, whether it's goods, ideas of people. That's certainly a spirit that resonates with us at the Atlas Society. The book was just included in The Economist's Book of the Year list, which is quite an achievement. A native of Sweden, Norberg is a senior fellow at both the Cato Institute and the European Center for International Political Economy in Brussels. He hosts documentaries on development and economics for American public television, including Free or Equal, Economic Freedom in Action, Power to the People, and The Real Adam Smith. Johan, welcome again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
And I want to warn everyone, we are having it's a little bit of a delay between Washington, D.C. and Sweden. So we'll try to take it slow and hopefully won't have too many hiccups in the programming. So Johan, first, congratulations on your new book, Open. In it, you point out that there have been many golden eras throughout history, across cultures, and more recently in Western culture and in America. What is a golden era? What does it look like?
Well, obviously, if we're looking for golden eras in history, we should start with the era that we're in right now and try to see if there are similarities with any previous efflorescence in history. And well, what we've seen now is that we've had 200 years of spectacular progress. We've seen amazing economic growth, perhaps of around 3,000% when it comes to the average wealth per capita in the most advanced countries. We've increased life expectancy from around 30 globally to more than 70 today. We've reduced extreme poverty from almost 90% to 9% today. So that's spectacular. This has never been achieved before. But there are episodes in history where we've seen attempts at getting there, when we've seen a rapid increase in scientific knowledge, in technological innovation, and some economic growth that, at least for some time, created rapid improvements for a small part of the globe. And we've seen that in all different civilizations whenever they've been relatively open. We've had it in pagan Greek city-states, in pagan Rome. We've had it in the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate 1,000 years ago. In China, Song China 1,000 years ago, they fought with gunpowder, they navigated with a nautical compass, and they printed books with a printing press. The three inventions that Karl Marx writing in the 1860s, said this is something peculiar to the European bourgeoisie. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about golden eras in history. Moments in time when there was subtly some liberation for individuals to think differently and start to improve their world.
So, Johan, I would also like to just sort of preface the conversation with regards to your book. What was the inspiration for writing Open? Was there work unfinished in progress, or is this a continuation, or was there a more immediate cause?
Yes, it's really what I do when I decide on what to write about next is I'm looking for the thing that people just don't get, where I find problems in the public discourse. And it differs. Sometimes it's about free trade. It's been about the financial crisis. Was this caused by markets or the government? And recently I've written a lot about progress, because this is the one thing that people just take for granted. They don't understand where it's coming from or even that it's there. So that's what progress was about, but I left some work unfinished with that book. I didn't explain really what caused it, the historical starting points, the ideas and the institutions that made it possible. And I also wanted to explain why it's constantly in peril and why people attack it. So in a way, if progress was the original Star Wars trilogy, this is the prequel and the sequel at the same time, but hopefully a little bit better than that.
Well, in terms of people being closed to new ideas, closed to new practices, you give the Romans as an example of a society that conquered many people, but were always willing to give up their practices when they came across better ones and adopt them. Today, we have a lot of anger and judgment. People are outraged and offended by what they pejoratively call cultural appropriation, whether it's a hairstyle, such as dreadlocks, or music, food, clothing. What is the danger, in your view, of that kind of thinking?
Well, the problem with the idea of cultural appropriation is that culture is appropriation. It has always been us looking for better ideas, better ways of doing things, or better looking things that will improve our lives, or so we think. And that's always been the case with, and you mentioned the Romans, it's Montesquieu, the Enlightenment writer, pointed out that the key to their success was that they were always willing, as soon as they had conquered a new territory, a new population, they were always willing to abandon their own key to any kind of progress, finding the right balance between holding firm when what you've got is something brilliant and letting go if you find something better. That's how you continue to make progress. And that's what culture is always about, no matter what you look at.
So I want to
Our
try to
haircuts, ways of talking. If I'm back, then
Yes, you are.
the good, thank you. The problem with condemning cultural appropriation is that you basically condemn culture. And this is a weird phenomena where we see this connection between a kind of radical postmodern identitarian left and a nationalist right. They think that culture has got to be something pure, something that comes to you from your ancestors, and you don't mix, you don't share, you don't combine, you don't remix culture. And then basically you lose everything that you've got, because it's all a combination. It's all a mixture between people who ventured out of the cave and out of our small territory and found new and better ideas, so that we got access to more brains and more creativity from other places.
Is there a downside or a danger of a society being open? Is it possible to be too open? Does that maybe speak to some of the fears that people have about outside influences?
Well, I don't think there are any downsides in itself to being open, because what it really means, it sounds like it's warm and cuddly, it's being generous to people. That would be nice. Perhaps that's a part of it. But the most important thing is that it's just plain long-term self-interest. It's a way of making yourself and your own, whatever it is, your family, your organization, your society stronger by getting access to more ideas and more creativity and more goods and services from other places. That's what openness is about. And that's why it's the solution to our problems rather than something that creates problems, because it only really means more eyeballs looking at the world's problems, so a greater chance that someone will come up with good solutions. But there is one problem, and it is that lots of people aren't comfortable, don't like it, because it's part of our human nature. We are traders. We constantly exchange favors, goods, ideas with others, but we're also slightly tribalist. We have this tendency to think that our group is something special and there are other groups there, and perhaps our relationship is a zero-sum game. And in that case, being open feels like we're being dangerously exposed to somebody else, another culture, another country.
Yeah, or another take on a philosophy is certainly something that we come across within the objectivist community, and people who are fans of Ayn Rand's literature and philosophy, that there has been, even within a community that should be committed to principles of independence of thought, and open exchange, sometimes a rigidity and I think a fear of wanting to exchange with people who share even maybe 95% of our ideas, but have a bit of a different take. And thinking of objectivism, and when you talked about it being in a country or an individual's long-term self-interest of being open, long-term self-interest, that perked me up, because in reading up on you, I read that growing up, at one point, you were active as a left anarchist. So is there an Ayn Rand connection? What contributed to that orientation early of left anarchism? Was it something that you just inherited? And what contributed to your rethinking and kind of making your way to a new worldview?
Yeah, that's an interesting part of my background, because I did what I think many people do when they're young, looking at the world, taking all the progress for granted, my lifespan, health, wealth, technology, and so on, and just finding the problems. And I associated that with, modern world after the Industrial Revolution, big industry, pollution, all those problems. And I wanted to find something different. And I think that two things changed my mind. One of them being history, just the fact of reading up on, my family background, realizing that life back before the Industrial Revolution and large-scale infrastructure and international trade meant that bad weather meant that they were starving, and many branches of the family tree were cut off during bad weather, basically, crop failures and so on. So I realized that perhaps this is not as good as it looks on paper. But Ayn Rand was an important influence on me during that period, because I read her early on, both fiction and nonfiction, and because she was very disturbing, because she was pointing that out constantly, that look, you're sitting there in your air-conditioned home with being fed by farmers on another continent, and you're blaming capitalism for all the world's ills. And this started an internal monologue or dialogue within me when I read her. And I'm afraid to say that I lost out at the end, because I realized that she had better points. And yeah, now I'm happy about it. I don't think I was then. And if I had to point to one particular thing in all her works, is the idea of the stolen concept, and the idea that as I did, and as lots of people, and prominent intellectuals and politicians constantly use concepts and ideas without recognizing what it's based on. And for example, obviously, I mean, wealth and technology is one of them, but also when it comes to things like epistemology and metaphysics, I was a nihilist and I denied the existence of an objective world, but obviously constantly I was taking it for granted. Otherwise I couldn't sort of talk to anybody else and trying to convince them that, for example, I didn't know that they existed. And that forced me to think through, what do I base this on? That's what my sort of eternal Ayn Rand told me. So what's your premise? What do you base this on? And I had to work backwards and realize that I really didn't base it on much.
Well, a lot of young socialists, self-styled socialists in the United States always point to Sweden as the ideal socialist system for the United States to emulate. That includes so-called democratic socialists like Bernie Sanders. But in your documentary, Sweden Lessons for America, which won Anthem's Excellence in Filmmaking Feature Documentary Award, you show that Americans really don't know much about Sweden. So is Sweden socialist?
It's fascinating how people only remember, and particularly Americans, I would say, they seem to only remember 20 years of Sweden's history. It's basically the 1970s and the 1980s, when we also had ABBA music and things like that conquered the world. This was the period when Sweden was really experimenting with socialist ideas. But what they fail to understand is, how did we become successful in the first run? And what happened afterwards when we began to experiment with those ideas. And just bear with me if I give you the brief introduction to Sweden's economic history. We basically had a 100-year episode of having one of the most open economies with the freest markets and the most limited government that the world has ever seen, basically, from 1850 to 1950. We were one of the poorest countries in Europe, but then a small group of classical liberal politicians, they got power and they began to change Sweden, open up the economy, and the result was 100 years of rapid growth, faster than any other country than Japan during those 100 years. And this meant that in the 1950s, we were one of the richest countries on the planet. And we still had lower taxes than other European countries and lower taxes than the United States. That has got the Swedish success story started. And that's obviously what socialists tend to forget. Then what happened was that social democratic politicians said, look, we've got all this wealth lying around. Why don't we start to just redistribute it and give it to help people out and to preferred interest groups and so on. And those 20 years, when they really did that, the 70s and the 80s, the size of Sweden's government as a percentage of GDP, the public sector, it doubled. We doubled taxation. We regulated the labor market. And that's not our success story. This is really the Atlas Shrugged moment in Swedish history, because that's when we started to lag behind other countries. We didn't create a single net job in the private sector during 25 years. And the big companies that you may have heard of, the IKEAs, the Tetra Paks and so on, they left Sweden. The innovators and the entrepreneurs, they left for other places. And this was a disaster. And don't just take my word for it. Listen to the Social Democratic Minister of Finance in the end of the 1980s, Kjell-Olof Feldt, who said that this experiment with democratic socialism was an absolute failure. It was absurd and unsustainable, and the only way to go was market reform. And that's what happened since. It ended in a terrible financial crisis in the early 1990s. Since then, from the left to the right, Swedish politicians have begun to reform the Swedish economy again, opening it up. And in many ways, it is now more open and more deregulated than most other Western economies.
Well, I want to get back to Sweden. There's always been a fascination, at least in the United States, and Sweden does do things differently. And I'm going to get to how you guys have done things differently with regards to the pandemic and your approach. But first, I've got some really great questions here from our audience, including from Jimbo the Coastie asks, right up your alley, Johan, how would you explain the benefits of globalization to workers who have been displaced due to outsourcing? So I think that is really interesting. I used to work at Dole Food Company. It was sold, to Ireland and to Japan and to, other countries where that they would have less regulation or a lower tax burden, and a lot of people were out of work. And you see those themes played out through J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. So to Jimbo's question, how would you explain the benefits of globalization to workers who feel that it's not helped them?
Yeah. Now, obviously, if it's the case that you lose your job because there's competition from someplace else, it's not a benefit to you in that regard, in that precise moment in time. But then two things: you have to look to the whole picture, to the whole economy, and also everything else in your life. For example, your purchasing power. But I'll get to that in a minute. But the first thing is that it does not just destroy jobs, it creates new jobs, but it does it in more competitive sectors where we can add more value, which means that we long-term create better jobs at better wages. That's what happens. And if you look at the broadest attempt at making any kind of assessment of what international trade does in a country like the US, there's a 20-to-1 ratio. 20 in benefits for every one cost in displacement, loss of wages, loss of business, and so on. And obviously that one has got to be taken seriously because, when you're unemployed, the unemployment rate is not 5%, it's 100%. So obviously that's a great loss to you. But we shouldn't forget those 20%, because that's the thing, or that 20-to-1 ratio, because that 20 is what makes the economy sustainable and functioning in the long term. If you were to protect all those jobs, obviously short run, it feels good, but long term, you become Argentina and you basically lose out all of the innovation, the upgrade constantly of businesses, and sooner or later you'll lose those jobs as well, but not from a position of strength where the economy can create new jobs. But I would also have to add the purchasing power part of international trade, because that's really the great benefit. The people are so afraid of, or at least politicians, of imports, but that, export is just the price that we're paying to get imports, to buy something. When I go to my local store, I do lots of imports, and that's a benefit to me. And the lower the price and the better the quality, the better off I am. And that's important to all of us. That means that we can create this amazing lifestyle that most of us have in Western free market economies. But it's most important for those who have the least, for those on the smallest incomes, because they have less money to begin with, but also they consume relatively more of things that are traded internationally, like home electronics, food, clothes, furniture, things like that. Whereas the wealthiest, they spend more locally in services, restaurants, healthcare, lawyers, and so on, which means that if you look at a place like the United States. If we abolished all international trade, the wealthiest 10%, they would lose only around 10% of their purchasing power. So they could probably afford it. But the poorest 10% would lose 60% of their purchasing power. So it's really a sort of a spontaneous, voluntary redistribution that's going on constantly because of free trade.
I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I think that is a very good start on making the case of how actually more openness in terms of trade can be of value to all strata of society, but particularly those who are just on those first few rungs of economic opportunity. I want to encourage all of you who are watching us, whether on YouTube or you're joining us on the Zoom webinar, please ask your questions. This is a tremendous opportunity, and we're very grateful that Johan has stayed up late to have this conversation with us. So I do want to, though, get to something which continues to be on the mind of a lot of people around the world, but particularly here in the United States, is Sweden's response to COVID. I believe that in the beginning, Sweden made what's considered by some a controversial decision to remain open and rely on more herd immunity. Is that even a correct description? And how has that decision played out as somebody on the ground in Sweden?
Well, Swedish authorities, they don't use the phrase herd immunity. What they've talked about is that what we're trying to do here is not to sort of stamp out the virus entirely, because the assumption is that no one can do that. It's bound to appear sooner or later. What we can do is flatten the curve of cases so that we can deal with it, so that the healthcare system is not overwhelmed. And then they made the decision, which I agree with, that to keep society as open as possible and recommend social distancing to people, recommend them if they can stay at home, work from home, if they can avoid public transportation and so on, you should do that. And it seems like Swedes, more or less, they abided by the recommendations, and we had a dramatic reduction in mobility in Sweden during this time. But it left some space for individual decisions, for local knowledge, because, you know, the planners and the politicians, they don't know what's most important to you and me. I mean, it could be you have to go to work because it's important to you and for your family. It might be that relationship or that older relative or that love affair that means everything to you. And that's something that cannot be captured in the great plans. And in a way, I think because Swedes got that opening, in a way, Swedes have agreed with these policies, sustain more social distancing long term, because we can make those exceptions.
Okay. I have another question here from Conchita Adsuar, kind of going back to the transition from Sweden being early on very gung-ho, free market, capitalistic economy with a lot of growth that created a lot of bounty that allowed people to question maybe we should be having a more redistributionist strategy, and then that not going so well. So Conchita wants to know, how did Sweden get its politicians to agree to turn back the tide of socialism when they saw it wasn't working? She observes usually socialism turns into authoritarianism, and despotic politicians can't let go of it no matter how bad people might prefer a freer system. So how was it just some benevolent economists and politicians who said, you know what, this is not a great idea? Or was it really more of a grassroots movement where people said, you know, this is not working? You mentioned some of the companies that left in terms of that Atlas Shrugged moment.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, because I agree. Had we in many other countries had this happened, we'd seen a turn towards authoritarianism. I think partly we have a long history of liberal democracy to thank, to be grateful for, because it meant that some things seemed completely unreasonable, even for some of the worst socialists in Sweden, and there were still a fairly decentralized society, so there were other forces blocking some of the worst excesses. Obviously, most politicians at least didn't change their mind. They didn't sort of happily accept the new free market ideas, but it wasn't as fun anymore. The money they were out of money. They thought they were in it to sort of distribute wealth to preferred groups. Suddenly they were out of money, and the international market said that we're not going to lend you any more money, basically. For a brief period in time, our central bank imposed a 500%, not 50%, but 500% to defend the Swedish currency, because no one wanted to hold Swedish currency at that time. So the politicians were basically forced to just try anything else to get through this mess. And then I think one of the most important things was that there were ideas lying around. There were political scientists and philosophers and economists in Sweden who had said for a long time that this is not going to work out, and we should try these more classical liberal ideas instead. And they were for a long time considered fringe people and made fun of, basically. But when this happened, suddenly there was this window open for potential change, and lots of people said, they actually had a point. So why don't we listen to them now when we begin a transition to new policies? And then in a very brief period of time, we got things like, reducing the size of government dramatically and taxes, introducing a school voucher system, reforming public pensions, social security from defined benefits to defined contributions, things that wouldn't be acceptable in the United States nowadays.
Great. Well, we have some other questions. I see a bunch of our regulars in here, including a lot of people who are generous donors to the Atlas Society. Phil Coates is here. He asks, in the US, in academia and the media, they tend not to be open to non-leftist ideas and thinkers. They do not hire, publish, represent those views fairly. Is that pronounced in Sweden and other countries, Western and Third World? Great question.
Yeah, and for some reason, I think it's a little bit better in Sweden than in the United States. And I don't really dare to come up with a hypothesis, but perhaps the fact that we went too far in Sweden in a socialist direction created an opening for challenging those ideas and introducing more classical liberal ideas and in that environment as well. So obviously you're up against steep odds if you have a rational free market perspective in Swedish universities as well. But at least there are some voices and some space there.
Got it. Jeff Rembolt, maybe this could be his question, is kind of a marker for trying to gauge sort of Sweden's political correctness and any media bias. Was the hydroxychloroquine denigrated in Sweden like it was in the United States? What do you feel like there was a politicization, or was that maybe more unique to the United States because of all of the political divisions of the past year?
Well, I guess it must have been denigrated because I didn't hear much about it in the Swedish debate. I don't think, I mean, and I'm probably not the right person to come up with a reflective answer on how that debate was going. But what I would say is that when we as Swedes look at the American debate became so incredibly politicized immediately, and you had to belong to a particular group and attack the others. It became very tribalist very quickly. Whereas in Sweden, that wasn't really the case. And I wouldn't say that we have much more of a rational climate of ideas. It could be that we have less politicized public health authorities in Sweden. We have a very different form of division of powers, where the public health authority is independent. It's not supposed to come up with politicized views. They are supposed to look at the facts, follow the rules, and the head is appointed by the government, but they're not supposed to listen to the politicians or be involved in the political debate, but just come up with sort of research and try to translate that research to others. So it's not as heavily tribal as it became quickly in the United States.
Yes, certainly it did. I think that's helpful to contextualize it because it was already, we were dealing with something in many ways novel, and we didn't have all of the information, and there was a lot of fear. There's still a huge amount of fear, but agreed that immediately there was a sense that it was being politicized, and that led to a lot of suspicion and animosity and inability to have an open, free exchange of ideas. Well, so this is one of my questions. I want to get back to audience questions. I want to encourage all of you to ask your questions on YouTube and on our Zoom. But of course, we're going through something very unopen right now in terms of lockdowns. I'm from California, Southern California. We're going back into a complete shutdown. Other places around the country, around the world. You've written a lot about the economic impact of lockdowns. How bad do you think the repercussions are going to be in the intermediate and longer term?
Yeah, it is bad. And we already knew that even before this pandemic. The World Bank researchers said that the great problem with pandemics, economically, but also by inference then health-wise, the biggest problem isn't the disease. It's not the cost of treatment and the deaths and the loss of production and trade associated with it. It's our aversion behavior. It's the fact that we're staying away from each other voluntarily, if it's in Sweden, but through forced lockdowns in much of the world. And that's something like 80 to 90% of the cost in most epidemics and pandemics historically. And I would say this time around, it's even worse because the lockdowns have been so radical. It's been quite dramatic, and therefore the costs long term is going to be huge. Partly in the first instance, because we then lose incomes, we lose wealth, people lose jobs, and we're seeing an increase in extreme poverty around the world by some 100 million this year because of that. But also then long term, just the fact that we're getting on a slightly smaller growth trajectory means that there are less resources going into healthcare, into research on new medical treatments and drugs and all those things that constantly, step by step, improve our health every year. So the cost of our aversion, staying away from one another, not being open, is going to be, I'm afraid, worse than the virus in itself.
Very interesting. Another good question by Jimbo, the Coastie. He asks, how would you characterize the Chinese economy? Is it crony capitalism? Is it fascism? A lot of times you'll hear in the United States it's called communism, and they do call themselves the Chinese Communist Party. So, but what is your perspective from outside the United States and more of a global economic view?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's complicated because I would say that it's mixed. We have parts of the Chinese economy that are communist, basically the state-owned enterprises governed by politicians and their cronies, and they get access to any kind of resources and funding cheaply that they want. And this is important for us in the West to realize, and it should be for the Communist Party to realize, that this is not why they've been successful for 30 years. These are the things that are dragging down the Chinese economy constantly, and they are basically destroying resources with every move of a hand or a lever or a machine. But the other part of the Chinese economy that's there is a bit of a mixture. It's struggling Chinese entrepreneurs and innovators who are trying to function in a market sphere, but constantly then being attacked and harassed. Partly because of this burden from the state-controlled sector, but also because the Communist Party obviously wants a piece of the action there as well and puts roadblocks on their way to progress. But that's important to keep in mind, because these are some great people, some of the best that China has. And when we see some of the successful exporting companies in China, this is why it's happening. And often they are neglected or attacked by the Communist Party. And when they want an IPO, suddenly it's just thrown out. If they want to implement a new technology or start a new app, then the Communist Party suddenly says no. So it's incredibly difficult circumstances that they're having. And this is, I think, the real key question for China's future. Where are they going to go? Are they going to go with the Communist Party and their control instincts, or are they going to let their entrepreneurs give them some more space? Because if they do the first thing, they won't be as successful in the future. This is one of the reasons why I'm not that afraid of China becoming the new sort of authoritarian super power economy in the future. Because if they want to be successful long term, they're going to have to become more like us, because sooner or later they'll run out of things to imitate and run out of farmers to put into factories and thereby get some growth. They're going to need innovation. They're going to need an innovative economy, and then they're going to need their innovators.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good point. So one of the questions that has come up over the past several years is about how do we treat immigration? How do we treat our borders? In an open approach, an optimal open approach, what is the way that we should be thinking about immigration? And more specifically, how does Sweden treat immigration? And do you feel that it's optimal, or would you find room for improvement?
Well, I'd say that in my ideal world, we wouldn't be talking about immigration, really. We would be talking about people who get a new job, who decide to move to a new place and rent an apartment or buy a home or what have you. And if they happen to come from somewhere else, what's the problem? If they are not a burden on society, instead contributing with new ideas and hard work, that's a great benefit to us. This is what any kind of urbanization is about. People moving to another place because they think they have greater opportunities there, and they increase the value of their labor because suddenly they're in a situation where the division of labor is more advanced and they've got complementary technology and other workers so that they raise their incomes. And that's really what immigration should be about, I think, whether it's a nation border or a city border. Obviously, that's not how most countries deal with it today. And Sweden is not, definitely, because we have this weird combination of being fairly open to people coming to Sweden, but at the same time making it quite difficult for them to work here for various reasons, partly because we have very strong, we don't have government controlled minimum wages, but we have very strong collective bargaining. So we have very high de facto minimum wages for low-skilled jobs, which makes it difficult to work if you're less productive, if you don't know the language, if you don't have the connections and the experience. But at the same time, it's very easy to get welfare. So we're basically creating a situation where people are large groups of refugee immigrants specifically who don't work and who rarely see people in their neighborhood working. And that obviously creates enormous problems socially, economically in Sweden right now.
And I think that for a lot of people who are concerned about the possibility of people coming here who have a need, right, who are refugees, they need something, migrants, and but that they would not necessarily be a net positive, that they would take advantage of social services that are paid by people who are working and who are paying the taxes. And I think that is part of where the concern comes in. We have another question, which, again, continuing on this theme that we're seeing of people with a fascination about Sweden. Drain Le McCall wants to know, is there a libertarian movement in Sweden? Yeah.
Well, there is in most places, I'd hope, but perhaps it's not as strong and forceful as we'd wish. I actually got some of my political education in one of the libertarian groups in Sweden, the Freedom Front, which was a combination of having intellectual debates and at the same time some civil disobedience. For example, we ran a speakeasy open all night, selling liquor, even though that was banned by the Stockholm authorities back then. So there are some groups like that. But what I think is more important and perhaps more influential right now is that, Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist, once put it that I don't think liberalism is really, in the classical sense, a party. It's more an idea that we'd like to see in all different parties, in different groups, influencing what they're doing. And I think that's what we're seeing in Sweden, that there have been strong and influential classical liberals in intellectuals, writers, journalists, economists, and politicians. And they are in different places, and they are in some of the Swedish political parties as well, influencing how they think about things, from the economy to COVID-19. And perhaps that's the way it should be. One voice is whispering in every ear, everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fascinating. All right, well, folks, we have about 10 more minutes, so slip in your last minute questions to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity to have a chat with Johan Norberg, author of Open. Larry Parks, hey Larry, thank you for your support, asks, free society with free trade assumes that one has real money. He is concerned that with paper money, the amount of money becomes unlimited money, resulting in unlimited spending, unlimited government. spending results in unlimited government, i.e. tyranny. How would you recommend that we get out of this spiral?
I share the worry, and especially right now, when you see how politicians and governments around the world have dealt with this crisis. They've basically just turned every tap on. And the latest numbers I saw said that governments in the 20 largest economies, they've increased their spending, and specifically borrowing, by some $5,000 billion, but central banks have increased their liquidity and just the money supply by $6,000 billion during this pandemic. And, that's a couple of thousand billions here and a couple of thousand billions there. That's adds up to some real money in the end. And I don't understand how this is going to happen without it destroying our currencies. And we really had some big problems before the pandemic, but this is getting even worse. So far, when they've increased the money supply, money hasn't been used that much. The turnover, the mobility hasn't been that great. So far we haven't seen dramatic inflation, except in the parts of the economy that we don't really measure when it comes to inflation, like assets, stock market, securities, and so on. So money ends up somewhere, and this really worries me. And I don't see the way out short term. Long term, we're going to have to take that discussion about what do we do instead, because it's not a sane thing to have this kind of power in the hands of almost discretionary, arbitrary decisions by some civil servants here and there.
Okay, here's a question. I'm not sure how it relates, but G Angel has asked it a couple of times, so I'm going to throw it out there, even if it's like off your area of expertise. I've got another question we can end up with, but G Angel wants to know about renting, leasing. Is it a superior model to private ownership? Is, quote, you will own nothing and then you will be happy, a threat to capitalism going forward into an era with limited resources? I don't really understand that, but did that speak to you?
I don't know if I got it right, but I can talk about what I think about when I hear a question like that, because some people now say that when we have new technologies and we all have smartphones, we end up in a great sharing economy where we realize that there are things that we don't need to own. We can rent it when we need it. Everything from transportation services to I actually have a friend who rents out her bathroom to people who need it and can just sign up on online if they have to go in the vicinity. And some people say that, look, this means that we've moved away from capitalism, that we've entered something else instead. And I think that's the complete misreading of what's going on. This is free market capitalism at its best, realizing how we use resources in the best and the most efficient way possible. And people realize that they can invest in everything from property to a car to particular tools and then rent it out at the best price through the help of modern digital technology. And I think that goes for, apartments as well. I've never understood this urge to, you've got to own it. No, we need property rights. That's what we need. And then for some people, it makes much more sense to rent because you become more mobile, you take less of a risk yourself. And definitely that whole thing with the government, like the US government, constantly trying to subsidize home ownership absolutely doesn't make sense. Try to make sure that We had strong property rights, transferability, and then a rental market that works without any kind of rent control and so on. That would, I think, create the best use of resources.
That is such a fascinating answer. I'm glad I spun up the question, even though I didn't quite understand it. But you got me thinking also about that in terms of the sharing economy. I am a part of the sharing economy. I rent my home through Airbnb, through Pure Space, now an Airbnb shareholder too. And I wrote an article back in the day and gave a speech, Would Ayn Rand Airbnb? Because it stuck in my craw. It still does a little bit. When we talk about just even the term sharing economy, and that there was sort of an aversion to thinking about it, and like, oh, it's, you're a host because you just really want to, have other people in your home, and you want to open up your home to other people. Yeah, that's part of it, but I'm, also want to make money and to provide people with a really good experience. So it's been interesting, and I think that although there's been sort of ups and downs with going the tech bubble of just sharing economy everything, and then kind of pulling back to what makes more sense, and now seeing additional things that are being rented and shared. So as we kind of wrap up, would love to hear from you, Johan, about the year ahead. What are, even though we don't mean to minimize the very significant threats and bummers and things that are not going well in terms of lockdowns and other potential threats on the horizon, but I always like to talk about optimism and gratitude, not as a Pollyannish orientation, but just as a way of grounding yourself in a sense of agency, even if things are really, really terrible. Sometimes finding things that are good, or that make you feel more empowered. So, what would you say to the audience, and particularly many of us here in the United States that are disappointed about politics and the most recent election? Some people are happy, but obviously a lot of people are also very disappointed. What are some of the things that we can and should be grateful for and looking forward to, in addition to reading your book?
Yeah, that's a reason for gratitude, being able to do that. Well, thank you. That's a nice way to end here, trying to see something positive in this, in the mess that we're in. Then I would point to one particular thing. It is just realizing where we're at, the magnificent gift that we've been given to be born and to live in this tiny part of human existence, when we've had these kinds of freedoms and openness and growth and innovation. Had you taken the past 300,000 years of Homo sapiens existence and condensed it into a 24-hour day, then the 200 years when almost everything happened after the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, and we saw this explosion of growth, that's the last minute of those 24 hours, the last 60 seconds. And we happen to be here to experience it. And I think of that specifically when I think about awful things that happen, and think about what would have happened had this happened to us in any other era. And take the pandemic, it's awful. And some of how governments react to it is even worse. But just keep in mind, where would we have been had this struck in any other era? It would have been more like the Black Death. Had this happened in 1950, we wouldn't have had a single ventilator on the planet. Had this happened in the early 1970s, we wouldn't have had any technology to read the virus genome, so we wouldn't have been able to create a vaccine. Had this happened in before the 1990s, we wouldn't have been able to meet like this. We would all have been isolated in our homes without any kind of connection to the outside world and to older relatives and so on. So it really means that if it had to happen, if the pandemic had to happen, this is the best time ever to experience such an awful event. And that, to me, is something that I'm grateful for every day.
Well, gratitude is a big theme for us at the Atlas Society. I had mentioned your #1 fan, Jay Lepere, the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Atlas Society, who has asked us to continue to work on that and elevate that, as we did in our My Name is Gratitude, Draw My Life, and as we are doing with this conversation. Johan, thank you so much. I know it's 11 p.m. there, so we really appreciate all of the work you do. Hope that this is one of many future conversations. We're very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. This was a pleasure.
And thank you to all of you who have joined us on Zoom and on YouTube and who are watching. Thanks, in particular to, I see a lot of our donors. John Lindell, don't think I don't see you. Thank you very much. And I want to encourage those of you who like our work, who enjoy these webinars, to consider making a end of the year tax deductible contribution. The Atlas Society is a nonprofit, and I mentioned our board is double matching all new and increased contributions. So donors like John Lindell upped their game a little bit this year, had an opportunity to boost that. So really appreciate all of you. Please join us next week for those who need a little shot of politics. My friend Jackie Pick-Deason is going to join us. Of course, she is the one who brought forward in the hearings in Georgia that blockbuster video of potential election irregularities. So she'll talk a little bit about that, but she's also a wonderful long-term expert on energy reform and energy policy. So please sign up. We will see you next week. And until then, just keep shining. You all are stars.